Sooner or later, every kitchen faucet starts to leak. The good news is they have lots of O-rings and washers available for virtually every make and model of kitchen faucet ever made. The bad news is sometimes the sink has bigger issues. In this case, this faucet is just beyond hope. The pot metal it was made out of has corroded, it's crumbling apart, so even if I could get it apart to replace the O-rings, it probably would never go back together again, and I highly doubt it would ever stop leaking because it's actually crumbling when I try to take it apart. So it needs to go away, and I bought a new sink faucet to take its place. So in this video we're going to take out the old faucet and replace it with the new faucet. The first step is I want to turn off the water. Some of these valves just turn 90 degrees and they're off. Other ones you got to keep spinning them until they tighten down. With the supply valve shut off, I want to turn on the faucet just to make sure the water really did shut off. In an ideal world, the shut-off valves under the sink will shut off the hot and cold water supply to the faucet, and you can go ahead and change out the faucet. However, sometimes you get one of those shut-off valves that, due to old age, doesn't turn, or it turns but it doesn't actually stop the water, it just slows it down. If you can't shut off the water under the sink, the next thing you want to do is locate the main water shutoff to your house. Now, ideally you know where this valve is already, because that's something you should be aware of just in case a pipe bursts or something like that and you need to shut off all the water to your house in a hurry. But if you don't know where it is, it's usually located somewhere between where the cold water pipe comes into your house and the water meter itself. So in this case, it's right here. Luckily, the valves shut off the water under the sink, so I can leave this one alone. But if they had kept going, I could come down here and shut off this valve. I've positioned a bowl under the valve because there's a little bit of water that's left in these braided lines, so when I open it up, just so that way the cabinet doesn't get wet. Not that it's never done wet under here before, but I like to minimize it. Now these are kind of squirrely because they're floating in midair on these PEX lines. So I'm going to use a pair of channel lock pliers to try and keep the valve body steady while I loosen up these connectors. If they were attached to rigid copper lines, it'd probably be a little bit easier because they wouldn't scoot around quite so much. One thing to watch out for when you're working on these is that you don't get the wrench snagged on the plastic valve handle, because if you break the handle off, that would be less than ideal. Now I'll move the bowl over under the cold supply and do the exact same thing. So here we're looking at the underside of the faucet. You've got the two sink basins here and here. The back wall of the cabinet is behind the camera, and I need to take these plastic rings off because they're what actually hold the faucet to the stainless steel sink. In order to unthread the plastic, I need to disconnect the supply lines. To To do this, just going to use the adjustable wrench. The good news is these connections look way crustier than they are. And I want to save this rubber washer for later because I'm going to reuse this supply line. And with the supply lines out of the way, I can go ahead and undo these plastic rings. Now sometimes I get lucky and they undo by hand. This one seems to require a little bit more persuasion. Sometimes the threads are just too corroded, you can't unscrew the plastic, or the plastic becomes brittle with age and the ears snap off, in which case the easiest thing to do is to get a chisel, put it right up alongside the threads and split it. Usually just splitting it like that takes enough pressure off that you can go ahead and unscrew it the rest of the way. If for some reason you find it doesn't take enough pressure off, we'll go ahead and go 180 degrees from the last split, split it again, and the whole ring comes right off. If you're reusing this faucet, which in that case I'm not sure why you're taking it off the sink, but if you are, you can buy replacement threaded rings at the hardware store. And we're replacing the escutcheon for the spray head. So I'll go ahead and unscrew that. Now I could fight with the spray hose connection down here, but the easiest thing to do at this point is actually pull the faucet up, and I'll unscrew this above the sink. What I want to do at this point is take a dishcloth or a towel and put it over the drain for the sink, just so that way any little parts that fall into the basin won't go down into the trap, because I'd rather not have to deal with that today. Here we have the spray hose connection, and it's a lot easier to undo that now that it's up here. Now I can go ahead and drain the water out of the hose, and I can pull the spray hose out. Now I want to use my 5-in-1 painter's tool and scrape up all the old plumber's putty that's left on here. At this point you want to make sure of one thing, that the front of the faucet is facing out, because the head of the faucet will swivel 360 degrees, and if you put it in backwards, it looks okay, but the handles are going to spin towards the wall instead of towards you. So if that happens and you get it all connected, you're going to have to disconnect it all and spin it around. So you just want to make sure it truly is facing the right way. This particular faucet has this plastic plate that goes on the bottom, and then the whole thing goes on the sink basin. The issue with this is there's now two seams that could leak water underneath. The one where the sink connects to the faucet, and the one where this plastic part connects to the bottom of the metal faucet. So we need to seal both those joints. And to do that, we're going to use regular old plumber's putty. And you can pick this up at any hardware store or home center, and it kind of looks like clay inside. And it has the consistency of clay. And if you just take a handful of it, it starts out pretty stiff and not very pliable, but if you just knead it a little bit, it starts to loosen up. And what I want to do is roll it into a snake and just start packing it around the top of this plastic piece. We'll do the same basic setup for the bottom of the plastic piece once this is stuck on the faucet. The biggest thing is you want to make sure the putty gets all the way up to the edge, and it's okay if it goes over the edge, because once this is all put together and tightened down, whatever squeezes out, we'll peel off and put back in the container and save it for a later day. Now what I want to do is take the plastic piece and push it into place on the bottom of the faucet. And as you can see, a lot of that plumber's putty is squeezing out, but that's okay. We'll come back to that at the very end. Now I want to repeat the plumber's putty around here. At this point, I'm going to set the faucet aside and turn my attention to the spray nozzle. The spray nozzle that comes with the kit comes with a two-part escutcheon that matches the design of the rest of the faucet. If this was an identical faucet to the one that was here, I could probably have just reused that. So this one has a connection right here, and then of course the metal escutcheon sits on top of the sink basin. So this needs plumber's putty as well, because remember, all this stuff here, it's subjected to splashes of water, stuff like that, and you don't want water that gets on here migrating underneath these parts and dripping on the inside of the cabinet, because that'll make a mess of the cabinet. So a little bit of plumber's putty is cheap insurance that you're not going to wind up with a big moldy mess under your kitchen cabinet. So I just pack that on like that. So with more plumber's putty, I can go ahead, put that in the hole, and I will go and thread this on. Now I can go ahead and feed the spray hose down. I'm not putting the actual nozzle on just yet, that'll come later. And I'm going to go ahead and feed the hose back up through the center hole. Teflon tape is totally unnecessary on any of these connections because the hoses themselves have rubber washers in there. That's what does the sealing, not the threads. Because of that, you do want to just double check that there really is a rubber washer down in there when you go to put it together, because if you install it without the rubber washer, it's going to make a big mess the first time you turn the water on. And I'm going to go ahead and snug that up with the adjustable wrench. I want to make sure that it's snug, but I don't want to turn it so much that it strips out the plastic threads. With that, I can go ahead and put this down through the holes. The holes are oversized for the parts that go down through them. So what I want to do is just eyeball this thing to make sure it's not racked one way or the other and that it's parallel with the back of the sink basin. And I'm just going to wiggle it back and forth a little bit to seat the plumber's putty. That'll help it stay in place when I start tightening it down. The other thing I did is I turned the neck of the faucet this way, so that way the weight of it's not trying to tip it forward. Now I can go ahead and install the new plastic rings, which are what actually hold the faucet in place. I'm reusing these supply lines, and I feel comfortable doing that because the washers are still in good shape. But if you question the water tightness of your supply lines, you might want to just go ahead and replace them at the same time. I've finished connecting the supply lines, I've turned on the supply valves again, and now it is time to test this thing out. So far, I don't see any leaks underneath the sink, so that's a good sign. Before we turn on the water though, the instructions that came with this faucet tell me that I should remove the aerator screen. So that way, if there's any debris from the manufacturing process in this thing, it'll get flushed out and it won't clog up the screen. So let's try out the hot water. Wait for the air to get out. That seems to be in order, and it is getting hot, so we hooked that up correctly. And it shuts off, that's important. Now we'll try cold water. And everything seems to check out with that one too. So we can go ahead and install the aerator, and let's see what it looks like with that on. Yep. Perfect. Now there's one more thing we need to do, and that is to flush out this hose for the spray head. And they had this hose folded up really tightly in the box with a zip tie around it, so it's going to take a while for all those kinks to work out of it. But what I can do is take the spray head off and set it aside, and we're just going to run some water through the hose. We'll let that run for a couple seconds, to clean it out, and this is done.